General Hospital will reveal Brad once believed he had everything under control, that with just one final move. He could leave Port Charles behind with $1 million in his pocket and walk away from the trail of ruin he had helped create. His plan seemed flawless: exchange his silence for cash. Sacrifice Portia's reputation as a final bargaining chip, and secure his own protection. But what he never anticipated was the cold, calculated betrayal from Drew. When the plan to expose Portia fell apart, when both Nina and Portia failed to shift the blame onto Willow as they had intended, Drew wasted no time in shedding accountability and pinned the entire debacle on Brad, transforming him from a middleman into the supposed mastermind. Panic quickly overwhelmed Brad as he realized that if Drew continued to control the narrative, he would be the one condemned. The one to pay the price for all the deceit and manipulation orchestrated by Portia and Nina. Brad had never claimed to be innocent, but for the first time in his life, he felt utterly and devastatingly betrayed. Drew didn't just turn on him, he publicly used his influence to cast Brad as the sacrificial lamb. With the backing of public opinion and the unwavering support of those rallying behind Willow, Drew cornered Brad with surgical precision, twisting every scrap of evidence into a damning indictment. What was once a lucrative promise of reward turned into a bitter realization that he was just another disposable pawn now that the game had changed. Brad had entered the deal believing he was a player, someone who could manipulate the outcome from the shadows. But Portia proved far more resilient than he expected. And Nina's manipulations couldn't sway Willow as hoped. As the plan unraveled and the web of lies collapsed, Brad came face to face with the harsh truth. Drew had never seen him as anything more than a contingency, a tool to be discarded the moment he lost his utility. Overnight, all the promises evaporated, replaced by knives in his back. Drew expertly crafted a new narrative, one in which Brad was the architect of the entire scheme. The key figure behind the drugging scandal that had rocked the hospital and nearly destroyed Drew's career. The panic that surged through Brad wasn't just fear of prison, it was the realization that Drew's public image was bulletproof. As the survivor of a ketamine-laced ambush, the devoted partner to the beloved Willow, and a rising political figure, Drew had the perfect stage to play the victim. And Brad, with his shady past and questionable alliances, made for the perfect villain. Every text message, every moment of footage Brad had hoped would shield him, was now being twisted into evidence against him. The same materials that should have cleared his name were becoming the noose tightening around his neck. With no one left in his corner, Brad watched as former allies vanished. Nina and Portia, once co-conspirators, abandoned him to protect themselves. Their silence, or worse, their passive compliance, only validated Drew's story. Brad knew he was now staring into the abyss. If he didn't act fast, he'd not only be ruined professionally but destroyed personally. The greatest blow wasn't losing the money, it was losing the illusion of control. For the first time, Brad was stripped bare, left without defenses, without options, with only one path: escape. But even as he fled the city, not as the victorious opportunist he once imagined but as a man defeated and disgraced, a new fire was igniting within him. The betrayal had carved something deep into his psyche, something darker, colder, more calculating. Brad wasn't just running. He was regrouping. And as he crossed the city limits of Port Charles, he carried more than just regret, he carried the raw, simmering resolve of a man who would return. Not to play by the rules, but to burn the entire board. And this time, he wouldn't gamble on anyone's mercy. This betrayal didn't just leave Brad stunned, it unhinged him. It unraveled whatever composure he had left and drove him into a tailspin of fear and desperation. Part of that fear came from knowing just how skilled Drew was at manipulation, how effortlessly he could rewrite narratives to suit his agenda. The rest stemmed from Brad's own fatal mistake. He had been too eager, too confident, too reckless. In his arrogance, he had exposed far too much, left behind traces and confessions. Offered just enough information to implicate himself in ways he couldn't take back. He had trusted the promise of a payout and underestimated the cold ruthlessness of a man like Drew, who would stop at nothing to protect his image and ascend the political ladder unscathed. In the chaos of his unraveling reality, Brad grasped for some fragment of comfort. Some familiar hand to hold on to in the emotional freefall. And so he returned, almost instinctively, to the only person he had ever truly loved, Lucas. There was a time when just the mention of Lucas's name could anchor Brad, a time when the warmth in his eyes and the softness in his voice had given Brad something close to redemption. But the Lucas he encountered now wasn't the same man who had once held his heart. Standing quietly from a distance, Brad watched Lucas laughing with Marco, his new partner, two men who seemed untouched by the corrosion of betrayal or fear, completely at ease in their private little world. They were sitting at a booth in a quiet corner of the cafe, a shared plate of fries between them. Marco smiled, leaned in, and playfully fed Lucas a fry, their fingers brushing as if the moment had been choreographed. Lucas laughed, his head tilted slightly, his face glowing with something Brad hadn't seen in him for years, peace. Brad stood frozen, unable to move, as if the sight alone had stolen the breath from his lungs. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was erasure. In that single moment, he realized he wasn't just alone. He was obsolete. A ghost haunting a love story that had already moved on without him. That realization cracked something open inside him. It left him exposed in a way that nothing Drew could have done would ever match. Lucas's happiness, uncomplicated, untethered from the toxicity Brad had brought into their past, felt like the final nail in the coffin of the life he had once known. And with no one left to cling to, Brad did the only thing that seemed to make sense. He returned to the place where this nightmare had begun, Drew's hospital room at General Hospital. Fueled by betrayal and emotional ruin, Brad barged in, unable to contain the storm inside him. He hurled everything he had left, all the information he had gathered, the data, the truths no one wanted to hear. He told Drew exactly who had drugged him with ketamine, laid out the connections, the motives, the evidence. In his mind, this confrontation would be a turning point, a moment where truth triumphed over manipulation, where he would finally reclaim some sense of justice or at least recognition. But Brad was wrong. What he received in return wasn't acknowledgement or vindication, it was cold, detached contempt. Drew didn't flinch. He didn't plead for more details. He didn't even react with interest. Because he no longer needed Brad. Brad was just noise, a complication Drew had already worked around. He had the story he needed. He had sculpted himself into a victim of betrayal, a survivor of political sabotage. In the eyes of the public, he was no longer just a businessman or a romantic partner, he was a martyr, a symbol of resilience. A man wronged by unseen forces yet courageous enough to rise again. And Brad, who had once been part of the machinery behind the curtain, had become the perfect scapegoat to fuel that story. Drew had everything he wanted, public sympathy, political momentum, and the unwavering faith of Willow, who now saw him not just as a partner, but as a man forged in fire, worthy of loyalty and love. Drew had elevated himself onto a moral pedestal that no smear campaign could topple. And Brad, despite all his desperation and fury, was now just background noise, a disgraced figure clinging to relevance while the world moved on. As Brad stood there in that sterile hospital room, facing the man who had outmaneuvered him at every turn, he felt the crushing weight of defeat settle over him. Not because he had lost money. Not because he might face prison. But because he had been discarded by everyone who had once needed him. Because he had become irrelevant in a story that had once revolved around him. Because, despite everything he knew, everything he had endured, there was no place left for him in the sanitized, perfectly packaged narrative Drew had created. And yet, beneath that suffocating sense of loss, something else began to stir. A slow, simmering ember of hatred. A refusal to let this be the end. Because Brad had nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous. Willow. who once harbored silent doubts about Drew, now found herself more certain than ever that he was the man she could trust above all others. In her eyes, he had become the very image of strength born from pain, wounded, yes, but standing tall through the ashes, unwavering in his pursuit of truth and justice. She saw him not just as a survivor of betrayal, but as a protector, someone willing to risk everything to shield her from the darkness that Nina and Portia had tried to pull her into. Each public appearance, each carefully measured word Drew spoke, only deepened Willow's belief that she had chosen the right man. She saw in him nobility, vulnerability, integrity. But what she couldn't see, what no one seemed willing to see, was the calculated theater behind it all. Drew had masterfully donned the mask of a victim, crafting a tragic narrative of betrayal and resilience that played flawlessly with the public and with Willow's heart. Every glance he cast downward, every pause in his voice as he recalled that night he was drugged, was perfectly timed. His pain looked genuine, his humility endearing. Yet beneath it all, his machinations churned. He was no helpless casualty of someone else's scheme. He was the architect of his redemption story, using others, especially Brad, as disposable scaffolding to elevate himself. Brad, who had once been promised a role in Drew's quiet, behind-the-scenes reckoning, was now nothing more than the burnt offering left behind after the final play. He had been sacrificed not only to save Drew's image but to forge Drew's transformation into a man reborn from injustice. As the dust began to settle, as the whispers faded and headlines shifted to newer scandals, Brad understood something with brutal clarity: there was no longer a place for him in this city. He had been erased from the narrative. Not redeemed. Not even remembered. Just erased. The plan he had clung to so tightly, to vanish with $1 million and a clean slate, had gone up in smoke. What remained was a pair of empty hands, a shattered name, and the looming threat of arrest that followed him like a shadow through every back alley and train station. Each step he took away from the center of town was laced with dread, knowing that a single misstep, a single sighting, could bring the law down on him before he even crossed the city limits. He didn't leave Port Charles as a man who had outwitted the system. He didn't leave with a triumphant smirk or a duffel bag full of cash. He left as a ghost, fading under the golden tones of a dying sun, swallowed by the silence of a town that had no more use for him. With each fading block behind him, Brad could feel the weight of memories pressing harder. Every hospital hallway he'd once walked, every secret deal struck in the shadows, every longing glance toward Lucas, all of it felt distant now, unreal, like echoes of a life that had never truly been his. Bitterness settled in his chest like lead. It wasn't just the betrayal that haunted him. It was the realization that no matter how hard he tried, he had never found his rightful place, not in the hospital, not in love. Not even in the game of survival he'd once played so well. He had always been tolerated, rarely embraced. And now, even those who once used him had abandoned him to the fallout. Brad knew that if he stayed, Drew would stop at nothing to keep his pristine image intact. If ensuring public sympathy meant ruining one more soul, Drew would gladly sacrifice him again, and this time, permanently. Brad didn't cry when he left. He didn't look back. There was no point. The version of him that had once hoped, once believed he could beat the system, was gone. All that remained was a man walking into the unknown, driven not by redemption, but by the grim knowledge that he had survived, barely, and that survival, on its own, wasn't a victory. Not yet. And yet, Drew's carefully orchestrated victory came at a price he hadn't fully calculated. In elevating himself to the role of the wounded hero, in purging Brad from the story with surgical cruelty, he had unknowingly created a new enemy. Brad was not the kind of man to forgive easily. He was not the kind to forget betrayal, especially when it had cost him everything: his name, his future, his last shred of dignity. Beneath the humiliation and despair, beneath the loss and isolation, something far more dangerous had taken root: purpose. Though Brad had fled Port Charles with nothing but fear in his chest and a bitter taste in his mouth, he had not fled empty-handed. Scattered across encrypted drives, buried within old devices and backup logs, Brad still held fragments of the truth, remnants of the real story, untouched by Drew's narrative spin. They weren't smoking guns on their own, not yet. But a whisper at the right moment, a stray photo from a hospital hallway. A security recording he had once downloaded out of habit or paranoia, any one of these could become a match, and in the right hands. They could ignite a firestorm that would burn far beyond Drew's polished public image. For now, Drew remained the public darling, the phoenix who rose from betrayal. The man who had overcome adversity and reclaimed his dignity, drawing sympathy and admiration from every corner of the political and social world. His connection with Willow only deepened, bolstered by the illusion of his honesty and vulnerability. But what Drew didn't realize was that while he had won the present, the future was a battlefield he had yet to conquer. And in that future lurked threats he could neither predict nor silence forever. Because Brad, in his exile, had become something far more dangerous than a scorned man, he had become a witness with nothing left to lose. He no longer sought validation or redemption. What drove him now was the deep, slow burn of vengeance, the kind that didn't erupt in a single explosion but simmered until the moment was ripe. He had seen firsthand how quickly public opinion could be swayed. How easily a well-timed leak could dismantle a reputation. And he knew the cracks in Drew's story better than anyone, because he had helped build it from the inside. Somewhere in the dark, in the forgotten corners of the very hospital where this web of lies had begun, Brad waited. No longer chasing a clean slate or a second chance. He was patient now, deliberate. He understood that to strike effectively, he had to let Drew believe the war was over. He had to become invisible, just another footnote in Drew's triumph, until the moment came to remind the world that ghosts don't disappear. They haunt. And when that moment came, Brad wouldn't need to shout. A whisper would be enough. A name dropped in the right ear, a file forwarded anonymously, a single memory revived from digital silence. Drew might have extinguished the immediate threat, but in doing so, he had seeded something far worse, a reckoning without warning. Because truth, like Brad, didn't die. It just waited in the shadows.